We want this morning to have plenty of sound and visual. We want to try and grab your attention. The aim of what we're doing with these services is once a month to give you an overview of a Bible book. We're starting with Genesis. We'd love for you to go away from each monthly service thinking, yeah, I've got an idea of what's actually in that book now. And that will be interesting for some of you because some of those books, to a number of you, will be really obscure, some of the later ones in the Old Testament. So let's have a look then at Genesis together. Genesis gets its name from basically the first phrase in the book. And in the Hebrew, that was Bereshith, in the beginning. We probably all know that phrase, don't we, from the beginning of Genesis 1, verse 1. But now here's what happened. When the Old Testament was translated from its original language of Hebrew into Greek, they gave it a slightly different name. They called it Genesis, where we get the name Genesis from. And that's the Greek word for origin. Okay, now this is high-level stuff. We're doing languages, we're doing complicated stuff. But the point I want to make really is that that's a really appropriate word for this book, because it contains an account all about origins. So if you remember nothing else this morning, it's about origins. It's about how things started and where things came from. The world, the universe, the human race, sin, and also, important to the plot that follows as you read through the rest of the Bible, where did the nation of Israel come from? All important things. Let me try and get across to you why origins are so important in this book. Right, now imagine, we'll zoom out a little bit if you like, imagine you're walking through the woods, yeah? You've started over somewhere over there, and you're trying to get to your destination, trying to get home, and you're lost. You ever been like that? Really lost, and you want your mum, and it's all getting a little bit sad, and you're getting a bit desperate, but then you get to a crossroads, and you've got some decisions to make ahead, and there's a signpost. But some cretin has come along, and they've kicked in the signpost, and it's lying on the floor. Can you see this signpost down here? Here we go. So there's a signpost, but what use is that to me? Oh, first of all, it's broken. Thankfully, not too badly. But second of all, it's lying on the floor. It's like all my DIY projects, this. Right. But we've got a signpost, haven't we? So what do you do? Now, this is an essential survival skill. Now, some of you will know the answer to this. But how am I going to work out how to get to my destination? Because I don't want to end up nowhere, do I? And I don't really want to end up just somewhere. I want to actually get to my destination. What do I do? It's a head scratcher, isn't it? It's easy, actually. What you do is, you know where you've come. If you know where you come from, you find the origin and you point it in that direction. And if you do that, all the others will be right. It will stop you going just somewhere. It will certainly stop you going nowhere. And it will take you to the destination. Do you see why origins are important? Really important to know about origins. Now, it's the same in life, actually. Many people are lost in this world. They don't know where they're going. They're stumbling through life in utter confusion. Have you noticed that? And it's all because, really, they don't know where they've come from. That's a big part of the problem. That's why Genesis is so crucial. It tells us our origin. And when we know that, if Genesis is right about our origin and can tell us all about that, it will help us. It will keep us from getting lost on the journey to our final destination. That's why it's so important. Now, I think you'll agree then that it's a really important book in the Bible. It's the origin book. And so you need to tune in. Here's the flyby. We're going to do this really, really quickly. Okay, we're doing this in different sort of levels, you see. The flyby is, oh dear, that's Tiago's props are also falling down. The flyby, we're just zooming over the top of it, looking at what's on the ground. So let's do that together. Chapters 1 to 11, we've got a few charts here. They give us a brief account of what we call primeval history. That's the period of the creation of the world and of mankind, all the way through the flood of Noah's day and then the dispersing of the nations through the ancient Near East, Turkey, Iran, Egypt, all of that sort of area. And they tell us, those first 11 chapters, all the essentials about where we came from and why the world is the way that the world is today. Now, the second half then, so chapters 12 and onwards, well, chapter 12 introduces Abraham, who in obedience to God's instructions leaves what we call Mesopotamia, and he travels down into Canaan. Abraham is the father of Isaac, who is the father of Jacob, who is the father of the 12 tribes whose families become the nation of Israel. Got it? That's the story of the whole book right there. You see, the rest of Genesis from chapter 12 to 50 is all about their story. We call them the patriarchs, the ancient fathers. And the book ends with the last character, who is Joseph, the story of Joseph. And there are about 70 members of his family who moved to Egypt because of a famine, and they settle there under Joseph's care. That's the zoom. We've zoomed over now. So just to put it on, for you to see it all on the screen in one go, you can get an overview by really, and here's the point, following the family line. So you've got to follow the family. Tiago is going to remind us, you see, about how the perfect world that God made in the beginning has been broken and ruined by sin. That's the story of Genesis 3. And the plot follows on from the promise that God makes when he curses the deceiving snake by saying, I will put enmity between you and the woman, your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, you will strike his heel. So it's all about offspring. And the reader is directed through the book to follow a particular family line. That's the plot of the story. So on the screen there you can see Adam and Eve. We start with them. They know that from their family line, the serpent crusher will come. Cain murders Abel, though. And so the family line follows the third son, Seth. And then we've got generations coming and going down to Noah. And in those chapters, early chapters of Genesis, the thing that stands out is the fact that everybody dies, because we can see the results of sin in the world. The world gets worse. It passes a tipping point. Genesis 6, God says that the world has passed that point and a flood must come. And so Noah, Japheth, Ham, and Shem, they all get into the ark and they're saved from the flood. We have the generations that get off of the ark, and they take us through to Babel and to Abraham. And we're following that line of Shem, do you see? Isaac comes along. He's Abraham's only son. Things were touch and go for a moment. But Isaac has two sons, Esau and Jacob. And we follow the line of Jacob, even though he's not the firstborn. We have 12 sons of Jacob, who are Israel. And the book ends with the story of Joseph, where everyone moves to Egypt. Got that? So you've got your snapshot there. That's the whole of the book of Genesis. That's everything that's in it. But we're going to now we're going to get into the helicopter now a little bit with Tiago, and we're going to hover over it, and we're going to see what else we can see in there. Tiago. Okay. Now we're going to get into it a little bit. You see, we've had our sort of flyby as we've zoomed over the book. We then got in the helicopter and we took a little bit of a closer, slower look over it all. And now we're going to land and take a walk through some bits of Genesis together. Now, one of the things I've noticed, and most parents will probably have noticed this as well, is that sometimes our children don't like to go on walks. But the other thing that I have certainly observed is once they're on a walk, they love it. So I encourage you kids, come on this walk with us, and let's take a closer look at what's in this book. The title I want to give here, really, for this short little talk, really, is His History is His Story. It's a great little line, isn't it? I think that picture comes a bit later. History is His story. And that comes out clearly, pretty much, in any book of the Old Testament that you read. But particularly, I think, it comes out strongly in the book of Genesis. Jesus is all over this book. Sometimes he comes across as a type. Yeah, we've seen this. But what I mean by a type is that perhaps it's a character there whose life actually looks a bit like his life. He's a sort of a type. So consider, for example, this is interesting, isn't it? That the book contains two saviors in the book of Genesis. Noah saves the world, he saves humanity, as it were, from a flood. Joseph saves the world from a drought. Interesting, isn't it? Two saviors on a global scale in this book. It's like types, suggestive, thinking savior of the world's a big thing God's into. Sometimes it comes across as a shadow that we see Jesus. So that would be an event or an object that prefigures Christ in some way, gives us a shape of what's to come. So consider the story that some of us looked at last week in chapter 22, where Isaac, an only beloved son, carries the wood upon which he is going to be sacrificed up a hill near Jerusalem. I mean, your eyes are bulging out when you read it, aren't they? But you have to remember that this book was written by Moses. And he wrote it centuries later, and he wrote it for a generation that had come out of Egypt and wandered for 40 years in the wilderness on their journey to the promised land. Well, that's going to be our next book. Next month, we're going to be looking at Exodus, and we'll see some of that. But as you read through Genesis, it's almost like as if the Holy Spirit, who inspired the book, is itching and anxious to reveal more and more of God's plan to us about how he will save the world from Satan and sin and death. And that's really the story, isn't it? We've got it up on the wall behind us. That God has made a promise at the beginning. And God is going to fulfill that promise and bring us to an incredible, wonderful end to the story. A story that goes on and on forever. And so everything in this book proceeds according to God's plan, to God's story. History is his story. Now, earlier this year, we can put that picture up now, if you like. Our family holidayed in Suffolk. I've mentioned this already before, a few weeks back. After exhausting all other possibilities for day trips, we eventually succumbed to the nuclear power plant that was local to us, and we went to Sizewell B, and we went to the visitor centre. Best day out ever, not. It's a massive power plant, and it's got loads of enormous, complex, dangerous systems and equipment, some of which you don't want to go anywhere near, this nasty stuff. But all of it on that entire site, everything there, is controlled by a very small crew, smaller than that on the screen, tucked safely away in a control room. We've got all the minions that fix stuff, but all the control there, just a few people in a room full of buttons. Now, God is, if you like, in the control room of the universe. God is in the control room of the universe. And he has everything running just how he wants it. Take a look at how that's put in Ephesians chapter 1. Just take a look at these verses. He made known to us, that is, God made known to us, the mystery of his will according to his good pleasure, which he purposed in Christ. These verses just ooze with the sovereignty of God in controlling the world. To be put into effect when the times have reached their fulfillment, to bring all things in heaven and on earth together under one head, even Christ, that is Jesus. In him we also were chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity to the purpose of his will, in order that we who were the first to hope in Christ might be to the praise of his glory. Now, that's the God of Genesis, right there on the screen. He is the ruling, sovereign God who works out everything in conformity to the purpose of his will. Notice two things there. He works out everything. Do you see that? Not just some things, everything. And he does so in conformity to bring it in line with the purpose of his will, not our will. And just as an aside, take a look at those verses just a bit more closely. What is the purpose of God's will here in these verses? It's not just to put Satan's head under Jesus' foot. It's bigger even than that. It is to bring all things in heaven and on earth together under one head, even Christ, just to put everything under Christ, that he would rule as king. Jesus will not just come to save the world, but to rule over everything forever. So things might look a little bit hairy from time to time as we journey through history, and Genesis is no exception. But like the author writing a book with history here, God directs the plot. The plot never gets away from him. He knows what he's doing. So let's look at how that plays out in Genesis. We've only got time to look at a couple of the more obvious ones. But let's start in Genesis 6. Tiago's already mentioned some of these things. Here, the wickedness of mankind has reached a level where, according to verse 5 of Genesis 6, every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts is evil all the time. Something has to be done. The world is out of control under sin. Mankind's hearts are, certainly. But Noah finds favor in God's eyes. That's what we're told. Here's a man who stands out in his generation. Here's a man, and if you wanted to sum him up, the way Genesis sums up why he's so different is because he walks with his God. He walks with God. He knows God. Noah is told to build an enormous boat. God even gives him the blueprints for it. And so he sets out. Presumably he gets the help of his sons, because sometimes they do help their fathers every now and then. And they start a project that might have taken as much as 75 years to complete. And every day you've got to get up and you've got to believe in what you're doing, haven't you? To pick up the hammer, pick up the paintbrush, get the nails out. Amazing, amazing story. But it is only when everything is done and everything is to spec and everything is checked off and everything is loaded and secured that the flood waters come, because God is orchestrating the story. It is God who shuts the door. It's God who guides this enormous vessel past dangerous rocks and other hazards. Have you ever thought about that? I mean, with all that's going on, the raging waters around it, perhaps we miss how perilous this story was. But God keeps the precious cargo safe. And not just because he's being kind to Noah's family, but because on board is the family line here through which his rescue plans must come to pass. Yeah, the serpent crusher's line is on the boat. Now, I don't know if this is really true, but a while back I read something a Christian scientist had written, who'd done the maths on the size and weight of the ark. Now, the weights, it's just some question marks there. What was? It must have involved a bit of guesswork, but anyway, he came up with a figure for what he calls the draft of the vessel. Do you know what the draft of a vessel is? It's the depth of the vessel that is below the water line. So how far below the water does the vessel stick? His claim was that when Genesis 7 verse 20 tells us something, it's not just a by-the-by piece of information. Look at what it says in Genesis 7:20. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 20 feet. Why so specific? Why do we need to know the depth over the tops of the mountains? This little detail is telling us, according to this scientist, that the highest peak still had enough water over it that the ark would not scrape its keel. Now, I don't know if that's true, but it's amazing if it is, isn't it? I'd love to think that that's right. But it would only go to emphasize again that God is in the control room. He's working the details out, isn't it? He's made a promise, and his promise will never fail. It's in his hands. Now then let's zoom on a little bit, and we'll come to Abraham. We've got the story of Abraham here. His story is told in chapters 12 to 25. Here is a man chosen by God to bring about God's plans through this man's family. And so he promises Abraham, this is pretty key actually for the rest of the Bible, 3 big promises. Promise of a great blessing, promise that he will become a great nation, a multitude no one can count. and that they will dwell in a great land. They'll have a great place to live. That's the big promise. Abraham, like Noah before him, we are told, what makes him special? He walks with God. He's another man walking with God. But the big obstacle in Abraham's life is that Sarah, his wife, is unable to bear children. What is to be done? Because God insists that this family line, this special line here, has got to come through Sarah. She is the capital P princess, as all Sarahs are, in my experience. Right? And so the plan has to go through her. She's important. Abraham cannot just trick the system and go and have, use what we call a surrogate to produce a child through another woman. No. That's not God's plan. And so after decades of holding on to that promise, holding on, and long after any normal person would have walked away and said, well, obviously God isn't going to keep this promise. When Sarah is 90, when Abraham's 100, a child is born. It's miraculous. It should not happen. Hands up any ladies who are somewhere in the region of 90. Anyone? Okay, yeah, we got at least we got Edwina down there. Yeah? Edwina, it can't happen, can it? No, it can't happen. And yet it does. Because God is in the control room. He's made a promise. Nothing will stand in the way of God's promise. Now, we haven't got there in our normal weekly Genesis series yet. But at the risk of giving away too much of the plot that's to come when we get there, I want us to consider finally Joseph. Joseph's life as a kid, right, when he's young and growing up, is great, right? He is Daddy's favourite. Now, hands up, any children here who are Daddy's favourite? Anyone here who's Daddy's favourite? Okay, that's great. You're not. Okay, he loves all of your siblings just the same as you, unless you're an only child, right? Okay, there's a little loophole there. But listen, Joseph was far from an only child, right? He had 11 brothers. Okay, that's just the brothers. And they were jealous of him. He didn't do himself any favors, as Tiago pointed out to us. Long story short, they tied him up and they sold him to slavers who were going down to Egypt, where they sold him in the slave market. Joseph's adult life was horrible. Every time, and have you noticed this in Joseph's story? Every time things seem to go well, they immediately take a turn for the worse. That seems to be his life. It's up and then it's down. He gets a good job in Egypt, he's loved by his dad, then sold as a slave. Great job in Egypt, falsely accused, goes to prison. He does well in prison, starts to, things get better in prison for him. He even helps out an official in Pharaoh's court who says, "Oh, remember," and he says to him, "Will you remember me when you go see your boss Pharaoh?" And he forgets. And so Joseph does a really long stretch in prison. It's miserable. But finally, he's released when he interprets Pharaoh's dream. Things are on the up. He warns Pharaoh about 7 years of drought. You know the story. Famine is coming. Joseph is promoted by Pharaoh to the highest position in Egypt, only under Pharaoh himself. And even better, one might be inclined to think that this is the cherry on the top. His brothers then come begging him for food. It's not seen them since they sold him as a slave. They come begging for food. He's the only one standing between his family and death. Is he bitter with a life like that? No, he's not. He forgives them. He provides for them. He provides for their families. Because Joseph, too, is a man who has learnt to walk with God. And so in the final chapter of the book, his brothers, they come to him one last time, still scared. One day, Joseph's going to turn on them and take his revenge. But listen how well Joseph has understood that God is in the control room of the universe. He says this to his brothers. It's in Genesis 50, verse 20. You intended to harm me. Yes, it was bad, it was wicked. But God intended it, that very act, God intended it for good, to accomplish what is being done now, the saving of many lives. See how Joseph had learned to understand the storyline going on in the world? Not only did Jesus believe that God works out everything in conformity to the purpose of his will, he also had an unshakable trust that when God makes a promise, his promise will never fail. And we see that in the book actually closes with this fact, because Joseph makes one final demand. Check this out as we put this verse up here, verse 25. A friend of mine used to quip that the keys to Genesis have all been left in the back door. And you can sort of see that here in the closing verses. This is the penultimate verse of the book. Joseph made the sons of Israel, his brothers, swear on oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. Why has he said that? Because he knows that God made a promise. God promised that this family would be blessed, that they would increase into vast numbers of a nation, and that they would have a wonderful place to live, a wonderful land. Don't forget my bones, says Joseph. I don't want to be buried here. I want to go where the promise has been promised. But it is his confidence in God's control that really points us to Jesus. And that's where we'll finish up this morning. See, the main players in this book, in the book of Genesis, their lives are essentially like our lives. It's funny to say that, isn't it? But actually, they kind of are. When we decide to walk with God, if we do, to follow Jesus, the life that we live usually turns out to be more of a roller coaster than a monorail. You get this? Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but a monorail, certainly the ones that we grew up with, you're seeing on the telly or whatever, they're basically a very safe and a very uneventful roller coaster, aren't they? That's basically what a monorail is. And there's no height restrictions to get on the monorail. There's no harness. There's no clamping devices that kind of crush down into your lap. There probably won't even be a warning to keep hands and feet inside the vehicle. It's just going to go slow and it's going to get you from A to B. Boring as paint drying. But the Christian life is rarely like that. It is rarely calm and uneventful. It is more often a white-knuckle ride, if we're honest, isn't it? The Christian life. It has its highs and its lows, the twists in life that frighten and disturb us. Turns at such speed that might make you want to cry and ask to get off. And you can't because you're strapped in. It's then that you need to remember, as Joseph did, that though you might not be happy with what's going on, you are safe. Your soul is safe. You are safe in the hands of the one in the control room of the universe, the one whose promises never fail. See, the New Testament contains a remarkably similar statement to that of Joseph's in Acts chapter 2. We're going to just finish by looking at this. It's the first time, this is said when the first time the gospel is preached after Jesus has gone back to heaven. And Peter makes this remarkable statement to the crowds in Jerusalem during the Feast of Pentecost, explaining why Jesus had to go to the cross and die. Listen to what he says. He says, Men of Israel, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did amongst you through him, as you yourselves know. This man, look what he says, this man was handed over to you by God's set purpose and foreknowledge. And you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it's impossible for death to keep its hold on him. See, Jesus' life too was a roller coaster, wasn't it? Just like yours and mine. And we're following him. There were the highs of the miracles. He mentions it there, doesn't he? Wonders and signs, crowds flocking to him. But they were followed by the shouts of a mob baying for his life. But all the while, God was in control. Don't we see that in the life of Jesus? His confidence that he is safe. It all happened, verse 23, according to God's set purpose and foreknowledge. They meant it for evil, and it was evil. But God intended it. He planned it. He worked it through for good and for the saving of many lives. That's what God does. For it was at the cross that Jesus redeemed all of those lost in their sin who come to him to be saved. And finally, as that roller coaster ride reaches its final destination, it finishes in the glory and the resurrection and the exaltation of Jesus Christ, the one who has crushed Satan's head, defeated him, Satan, sin, and death. That's what Genesis is all about. So, Tiago, back over to you.